Welcome to the channel where I create content for people to improve their fitness, their force production, and freedom of movement. So not many people get excited about the concept of a video that's about rest periods, but when you consider that the rest period is a component of the full working set, it's something that we have to take into consideration. And so what I've tried to do is make it as practical as possible. If there's any of these particular components that you feel are relevant to you, you can just screenshot that or you can save that little bit of the video. The old school common sense approach to rest periods is something that you might remember from GCSE or A-level textbooks. Or if you've searched any really popular websites like Healthline is the example here, they will tell you things like, for hypertrophy, you need to rest for 1 minute because you need to chase the pump. If you're training for strength, you need 3 to 5 minutes rest because you need full recovery for maximum effort work. And then for endurance, you need to rest less than 30 seconds because that's directly training your ability to be able to do more work in a shorter period of time because that's what endurance is. But the research does not back up these common sense thought processes. And so the next most logical question is, what is it that actually causes you to need rest? Because if you don't know what it is that causes you to need rest, then you're not going to be able to understand how long you need to rest. Metabolic stress in the musculature increases as we exercise. If sufficient nutrients are being delivered to our working musculature, and the metabolic stresses that are being produced as a result of this exercise are being removed at a faster rate than they are being produced, then we'll be able to continue this exercise for a long period of time. At the point where the production of those metabolic stresses is beyond the ability for us to remove them, sufficient nutrients to sustain the activity that you're performing will be hindered at this point, and as a result, you will have an increased level of fatigue. The more stressful an activity you're performing, the faster this process will occur. Think of it in the way that if you are performing an activity that your body can deal with very comfortably, you will be able to deal with all of those metabolic stresses, you will be able to get energy to your muscles, and you'll be able to perform that exercise for a long period of time. But as the amount of stress increases, as the amount of effort increases, there will be an increase in the buildup of those metabolic stresses, which cause muscle pain, muscle damage, increased body temperature, which are just some of the things that cause us to not be able to sustain activity. And so generally, fatigue is a decreased ability for a desired stimulus to take place. And so obviously slowing down or stopping those stresses from building up or removing yourself from an environment where that stress or that effort has to happen, you're going to be in a position where you're going to be able to start dealing with those metabolic stresses, and as a result your fatigue will reduce and your potential performance will start to increase again, which is what happens when we rest. And so by this logic, the rest period should be a part of the working set to allow the intensity of your activity to be maintained or performed. And so what is the appropriate level of effort for these above mentioned stimuluses for hypertrophy, for strength, and for endurance? What is the stimulus that is required to drive improvements in those things? And the answer is, unfortunately, it depends. But I'm going to break things down into 3 sections, and they're going to be through the lens of 3 different groups of people. The first one will be through the lens of a beginner. So if you're new to the gym, you've just started, this is the one to watch. Through the lens of somebody who is trying to level up. So somebody who is moving away from a beginner, or they want to do what is required for them to be able to be proficient in the gym. Not somebody who is going to dedicate their entire life to it, but somebody who wants to do things properly and do them well. And then through the lens of somebody who wants to do absolutely everything possible to maximize their progress, whether it be from an endurance or a strength or a hypertrophy perspective. So as it turns out, beginners are very bad at being able to predict what actually 10 out of 10 effort is when it comes to gym-based movements or new activities in general. So instead of focusing on trying to put in as much effort as possible, priority for hypertrophy work should be to learn how to make the muscle that you want to make work contract. So you're going to try to take the musculature that you're trying to train to a level of about 8 out of 10 to the point where it starts to burn, and you can understand that, okay, the muscle that I am trying to train here is actually being trained. You're not having much musculature around that area contributing to the movement. You are always going to have neighboring musculature assist with the process of either stabilizing or moving a joint. It's extremely difficult / maybe impossible to make the neighboring musculature not contract and contribute to movements when you're trying really hard. So this is another reason why it's probably beneficial to only try to an 8 out of 10 territory until you understand truly how to train the musculature that you're trying to train. You do need to have some kind of level of intensity, and that's why 8 out of 10, as long as you take it to the point where that musculature is burning, your brain will be learning from that process, and that is what is the beginning point of learning how to grow your muscle mass. 7 out of 10 for strength. The weight that you're lifting needs to be somewhat perceivedly heavy. So if you're trying to maneuver a weight and it feels at about 7 to 8 out of 10, that is probably heavy enough to begin with, because the priority here is not to try and train at a 10 out of 10 effort, because again, you don't know how to. It's to be able to learn how to move perfectly. And so typically for people who are doing squat, bench, and deadlift, the prime kind of strength-based activities, we don't want to feel those movements in any singular joint. The idea is that you are spreading the load evenly across your ankles, your knees, and your hips, and your spine when you're doing a squat or a deadlift. When you're doing a bench press, you're feeling it equally across your wrists, your elbows, your shoulders, potentially your upper back shoulder area as well. So you're not trying to feel a bench press in your shoulder. You're not trying to feel a squat in your knees. You're trying to spread the load. An endurance-based activity should probably be performed at a very light level, at a very easy state, because at this point in time, it's probably beneficial just to get the foundation set. One of the reasons I find that people don't do cardio is because they dread the feeling of how it's going to feel. They don't like the feeling of going out for a run and being extremely tired as they get towards the end of their run. So instead, just build a huge foundational base of 6 out of 10 work, which is basically fast-paced walk or a slow and gentle bike ride, something that's easy, something that you're not going to dread if it's scheduled for tomorrow or if it's first thing in the morning after you wake up. It's just a thing that you do and it actually doesn't feel that bad. Through the lens of somebody who wants to level up. Coming back to this table again, intermediate people still can't predict what a 10 out of 10 is. So the objective for this group of people is to try and find out what 10 out of 10 feels like. That's the objective. You've moved away from a beginner territory. You now understand how to train your musculature. You understand how to do the movements. You understand and you have developed a large base of low-level endurance activity, and now you're ready to start pushing things to a higher intensity. With all of these 10 out of 10 efforts from a strength perspective, hypertrophy, or from an endurance perspective, form must be prioritized and it must not change at any point when you are increasing the intensity towards a 10 out of 10 effort. That is the number one priority across the board. From a hypertrophy perspective, movement manipulation will come in the form of, as the reps begin to get hard, you will subtly change the movement to encourage or include other surrounding musculature more than you previously were. Think about doing lateral raises with dumbbells and then including a shrug towards the end. By doing the shrug, your brain thinks you're getting the dumbbell higher, but you're not actually training the musculature that you're trying to train. Typically with hypertrophy-based movements, you're not actually lifting that heavy. So it's not that the movement that you're performing is bad. It's just that you're taking away from what you're actually trying to do. So you're wasting effort and you're wasting time. From a strength-based perspective, movement manipulation will cause you to shift the pressure from an even distribution across all of your joints that are contributing to the movement to increasing the amount of pressure that one joint may be taking, or one side of your body may be taking, or one set of musculature may be taking. These are all movement manipulations that over the long term are more likely to cause some kind of an injury or some kind of a setback or some kind of a plateau. From an endurance perspective, anytime that you flail your body in a less than optimal way to propel you through the air or through water, anytime that you're manipulating your body's way of doing that in a method that does not substantiate optimal movement, that is movement manipulation in endurance-based activity. For optimal muscular growth, a 10 out of 10 effort is required. So your adaptation should be focusing on trying to figure out what actual muscular failure feels like. And I personally think it's easier to learn how this feels through hinge-based movements or small muscle groups to begin with. So for example, training your biceps because it's a simple elbow joint, so quads or hamstrings, or smaller muscle groups like your forearms. Those movements are typically easier to stabilize your body to be able to make the musculature do what it's supposed to do. So if you initially learn how to do it with these movements and then try and apply that same feeling to the more complicated joints, you're then going to understand to a better degree how to do it properly with the more complicated movements. From a strength perspective, 10 out of 10 isn't actually needed for long-term progress in lifting heavy loads. The main driver in lifting heavy things seems to be more towards, as long as you're lifting a certain weight, as long as you're lifting heavy, it's the volume that mainly drives your strength over time. So reps in reserve is something that's really important to consider for people who are trying to get stronger. You don't actually want to be training at a 10 out of 10 effort every single week, because when you do that, you're subtracting some of the volume that you will be able to tolerate from a strength-based perspective, and you will be instead using that stimulus to drive muscular growth rather than contributing to more reps at the same weight with perfect form, which will in the long term drive strength rather than hypertrophy. So at this point, your adaptation that you're aiming for, the thing that you're trying to aim to be able to do, is to establish what a true 1 rep max is, technically perfect 1 rep max. This may take multiple attempts of lifting loads that are in that 90% territory to understand how to actually truly spread the load across multiple joints, to truly understand that when you are able to go at a 10 out of 10 effort, movement manipulation does not occur, you just slow down. That's what you're trying to get to as a strength athlete, your ability to maneuver your body slowly with an extremely heavy load without a movement breakdown would be the definition of an accomplished strength athlete. If as a result of you lifting heavier and heavier loads, your form gets worse and worse, then you're still in that person who wants to try and level up, and your objective is to get to the point where you can go 10 out of 10 without any form breakdown. In endurance, the introduction of 10 out of 10 here is to be able to establish a maximum speed of movement with no loss of form. So whether it's running, whether it's swimming, whether it's cycling, this is the maximum speed of your ability to propel yourself through space. It's a skill that you have to learn, and that'll become clear in the next phase why that's important. And so now we're into the phase of somebody who wants to do as much as possible to make as much progress as possible. If you've reached this stage or you're interested in this stage, you will know what actually 10 out of 10 feels like now. Whether you're lifting heavy loads or whether you're trying to train your musculature, you will now understand what 10 out of 10 truly feels like. This graph really clearly shows it. From a hypertrophy perspective, the closer that you can get to absolute muscular failure, the more pronounced your results are going to be. So that's why I've labeled it as 11 out of 10, because that is what you should be trying to establish on every single working set. You now understand how to take your musculature to a 10 out of 10 effort, so you need to be doing that on a regular basis to truly drive muscular growth. From a strength perspective, you should now understand what a true 10 out of 10 effort is, or a 1 rep max. And you should now understand that you can't do that every single week. You can't do that every month. It's a thing that you have to prepare for to be able to prime your body to be able to achieve that goal. So the goal at this point is to lift the lightest weight possible that will allow you to drive that adaptation of increasing strength. And you want to be doing that on a regular enough basis that it actually drives improvement. This is going to be somewhere in that 90% territory, but taking your reps to failure is not only not important, it's actually detrimental to your performance if you're trying to get stronger. And this is where reps in reserve actually becomes very useful. Once you understand truly what a 10 out of 10 effort feels like, you can then better predict what 8 out of 10 and what 9 out of 10 actually feels like as well. From an endurance perspective now, there are 3 different zones that we're working in. Hard efforts that are short, hard efforts that are long, and then slow and steady efforts. The slow and steady efforts are the ones that we brought in as a beginner. You're just trying to have a huge volume in that slow and steady state process. The hard and fast is the one that was brought in the previous phase, where you're trying to move yourself through space as fast as possible with perfect form for a very short period of time. And then the new one that we've introduced into this phase is you're not going at a 10 out of 10 pace, but you're picking a time frame that is longer than the short effort, but you're going at a pace that is as hard as you can possibly sustain for that longer period of time. Let's put a hypothetical of a 3-minute period. You're not going to be able to go 10 out of 10 from the offset in a 3-minute period because your speed will just gradually decrease. And so the objectives in these hard and long efforts is to sustain as high an effort as possible for the entire time frame instead. So it soon feels like a 10 out of 10 effort, but it technically doesn't start as a 10 out of 10 effort. So when it comes to rest periods, what does this actually mean? In a nutshell, if you're a beginner, you're trying to prioritize your movements to be perfect, and you need appropriate recovery to be able to perform those movements. For the most part, you can't actually train at a 10 out of 10 effort, so that full recovery is going to be less than somebody who is further down the spectrum of performance. For somebody who is trying to level up their performance, your objective here is to understand how to train at a 10 out of 10, whether it's strength, whether it's hypertrophy, or whether it's endurance-based performance. At this point, you want to make sure that you have full recovery to be able to sustain those repeated efforts of attempting to get to 10 out of 10 efforts. And if you are the person who is trying to do as much as humanly possible, from a strength perspective, you might want to consider some sport-specific rest periods as you get closer towards competition, but generally you can rest intuitively. From a hypertrophy perspective, you need to rest intuitively and make sure that you can sustain the total amount of load and the total amount of reps that you're going to be performing that drives the stimulus for increasing muscle mass. And from endurance perspective, it depends. So through the lens of a beginner again, following the assumption that they don't know how to perform a 10 out of 10 effort, they don't need full recovery to be able to perform multiple sets. At this stage, volume of practicing perfect movements is the priority. And so at this point, it's not so much about training as hard as possible. It's a case of getting as much work in within the timeframes that you're training so that you can begin to set the foundations to make real progress in the next phase. So now we understand that a 10 out of 10 effort is required for muscular growth. We can also put some loose parameters of how long we need to rest for that. You need full recovery to be able to perform 2 10 out of 10 efforts if you're going to lift the same load again for the same amount of reps and have the same amount of effort. We can loosely assume that people are probably going to be fully recovered from somewhere between 3 to 5 minutes, but at this point, you're trying to learn how long you actually need to rest. Some muscle groups, because you have a more localized muscle discomfort, like a bicep curl or a tricep extension, you may not feel as centrally fatigued as if you're doing something like a row or a Romanian deadlift, where there's a lot more musculature that is involved in those movements. So even though you're still trying to train hypertrophy at this point, some of those will feel like they need more rest than others. And so at this point, you're trying to learn what the optimal recovery is for those different muscle groups. But as a general rule, if you can't sustain the same amount of reps and weight for at least 2 sets, the recovery period in between isn't enough. From a strength perspective, the same thing stands. If you aren't able to lift that load perfectly between your 2 sets, then the rest isn't sufficient. To understand why this logic is important, so in this study, the volume that was attained during 3 sets where you have 3 minutes recovery between each set, so you're trying to go as hard as you can for a set, 3 minutes rest as hard as you can, 3 minutes rest as hard as you can. The volume that was attained within that experimental protocol was more suitable to drive muscular growth than a group that did as hard as they could, 1 minute rest, as hard as they could, 1 minute rest, as hard as they could. It makes sense logically because the group that had 3 minutes rest did more work. There is a caveat to this. If the volume is matched between those 2 groups, it doesn't actually seem to make as much of a difference. However, from this research, it means that you're probably going to be doing at least 2 to 3 more sets on top of that. And so I've laid out here in this table an example of what that could look like. These are numbers used from the study to give you an understanding of what this actually means in practical terms. If you were to do 3 sets to failure with a full 3 minutes rest, it means that you are more likely to be able to sustain your higher level of work 3 times in a row. The total amount of time that's going to take is about a 12-minute period. If you were to do 3 sets back to back with 1 minute rest, you would save about 7 minutes, but the amount of work that you're doing is about 25% less. So what the research suggests is if you are to match the amount of reps that you do within that workout to the same amount as what you could do with 3 full minutes rest, you can do that, but it takes 2-ish extra sets and you might save around 3 minutes per working exercise. And these are adapted numbers because they didn't give the exact, but this is based off of what the numbers kind of indicated based on the amount of total reps they did, how many extra sets they had to do. So you would imagine logically that your first set you're going to do 16 reps because you're going to go 10 out of 10. Then you have a minute and you can do less reps. So you do 11, you do a minute, and you do 9, and you do a minute, and you do 6, minute and 6. You're still going to get the same amount of work in total. But from my perspective, personal opinion, if I only have to do 3 sets really hard as opposed to doing 5 sets really hard and basically being tired that entire time, I know which one I'm going to choose. But you are all able to make your own decisions, and this is hopefully going to help you to be able to make those decisions too. As long as you're training at the level of intensity that is required to drive your adaptation that you want to see. So from a strength perspective, it's volume over a period of time, as long as you're lifting heavy. From a hypertrophy perspective, it's your training at 10 out of 10 effort. As long as you're maintaining the total amount of volume of work, there doesn't really seem to be much of a difference. But it means that you can achieve more volume in less sets if you were to take a full recovery between your sets. And that is why the suggestion here for hypertrophy and for strength is somewhere between 3 to 5 minutes. From the lens of somebody who is trying to do as much as possible at this point, the research suggests that at this stage, when you are a very proficient lifter, that intuitive resting is fine because you know that you need full recovery. You know that you need to be able to sustain the amount of weight that you're lifting or the amount of volume that you're doing. And so you understand that you need full recovery to be able to do that. You don't have to time your rest at this point. You just know that if, for example, going off the previous table, if you were to do 16 reps and then on the next set you only managed to do 15, you can assume that either you're underfueled or under-recovered. And this is going to be so independent to you. You may need 5 minutes recovery from a max effort bicep curl. Some people might only need 3. Some people might need 7 minutes to recover fully from a max set of hack squats. The reason that the rest period for strength here is such a big range is because typically people who are training for strength, a lot of them will be interested in powerlifting competitions. Sometimes in powerlifting competitions, you may be resting for up to 15 minutes between your flights or between your attempts. So potentially as you're getting closer to that competition period, getting used to some kind of competition specific rest period could be beneficial. But generally as a rule of thumb, there's no downside to resting longer for these training attributes. From an endurance perspective, at this stage, there's multiple things that we need to consider and multiple strategies that are probably outside the scope of this video, but they do include lactate tolerance sessions where you're on purposely not trying to recover enough. So as a result of exercise, we know that you'll get an increase in metabolic stresses. As you rest, those metabolic stresses will return back towards baseline. If you were to continue at the rate that increases that level of metabolic stresses, you're going to hit a point where you're going to stop. So a common strategy to really screw people over, which is not an enjoyable experience, is they will take themselves to the point where it's close to failure, and then they will give themselves almost enough rest, and then they'll take themselves to close to failure again. Every single time they do a new set, they just get that closer and closer bit to actual metabolic failure, which is a more advanced strategy, but that's the point of what we're talking about here. So we can loosely categorize rest into 3 sections: not quite enough recovery, full recovery, and no recovery. So you can do the hard and short efforts and the hard and long efforts with either a full recovery or not quite enough recovery for different training adaptations. But typically there should always be a foundation of some kind of low-level steady state exercise as well from an endurance performance perspective, but typically we should all be doing this anyway, just from a health perspective too. So realistically, for endurance-based performance, it depends. And here's some more research just to kind of back everything up a little bit more. 3 minutes rest is better than 1 minute rest for hypertrophy. More than 1 minute rest is better for hypertrophy than less than 1 minute rest. And metabolic stress is one component of hypertrophy, but it doesn't mean that you need to neglect the other aspects of growth. So that comes back to the nuanced argument of whether it's better to do 3 sets with a higher rep range than it is to do 5 sets, equating the total volume. Which of those is better? Potentially, it's the one that allows you to lift the most mechanical load as well as the one that causes metabolic stress. So there we have it. In a nutshell, if you're a beginner, you're trying to prioritize your movements to be perfect, and you need appropriate recovery to be able to perform those movements. For the most part, you can't actually train at a 10 out of 10 effort, so that full recovery is going to be less than somebody who is further down the spectrum of performance. For somebody who is trying to level up their performance, your objective here is to understand how to train at a 10 out of 10, whether it's strength, whether it's hypertrophy, or whether it's endurance-based performance. At this point, you want to make sure that you have full recovery to be able to sustain those repeated efforts of attempting to get to 10 out of 10 efforts. And if you are the person who is trying to do as much as humanly possible, from a strength perspective, you might want to consider some sport-specific rest periods as you get closer towards competition, but generally you can rest intuitively. From a hypertrophy perspective, you need to rest intuitively and make sure that you can sustain the total amount of load and the total amount of reps that you're going to be performing that drives the stimulus for increasing muscle mass. And from endurance perspective, it depends. I'm not going to do the hard sell, but you know what to do if you like this video. Thank you.